Howdy, partner, with Poland News. We are doing a series entitled Poland and the U.S. Empire. To understand global affairs and foreign policy, it is critical to listen to actual experts and not the makeup-caked teleprompter readers that litter mainstream media. So today, it is my privilege to have a very special guest, an expert analyst with decades of experience in foreign policy matters, Andrei Rajewski, who writes under the pen name The Saker. Saker, welcome. And can you tell us briefly about your background related to foreign policy matters?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me. My background is that I was born in Switzerland. I studied international relations, strategic studies in the United States, got 2 degrees there, then came back, served first as a consultant for the military, as an analyst, specializing in force planning and operational training. I also did some work with the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research and also worked as a consultant in humanitarian organizations. And I've been writing a blog on this topic for now 10 years called The Saker Is, and that's, I think, the short of it.
Very good. Saker, can you please describe what exactly is the U.S. empire?
Actually, that is a very good question, and it's a controversial one because there are different views on that. I think fundamentally, I call it the Anglo-Zionist empire because it's a mix of at least two. That could be more accurate than that. But it's on one hand what is sometimes called the Anglosphere, the Five Eyes, basically the remnants of the former British Empire, which is a key component of that. And secondly, again, there could be a discussion when that really appeared, but certainly Israel has become a major factor in U.S. foreign and I would argue internal politics. And it's not so much Israel as a country or the Jewish people as an ethnicity. I think it's the ideology of Zionism, which, for instance, can be shared by non-Jews. You've got in the United States what's called evangelical or Christian Zionism. So I speak of an Anglo-Zionist empire, which is spread internationally, so it's not just one country. It has, I would say that its characteristic are a specific mindset. First of all, it's profoundly messianic. That is, again, there are several strains of that kind of messianic ideology. Some people speak of manifest destiny. In the past, it used to be the white man's burden. Then it could be the struggle for democracy and human rights worldwide. It doesn't really matter, but the people who run that very powerful empire are convinced, A, of their superiority culturally, historically, and I think it's sometimes actually even racially. There are also people who believe profoundly that they have a mission to run the planet, and therefore, for instance, one of the consequences of that, they are not particularly concerned by international law. Again, you can see that very clearly in the case of the United States and Israel, who violate international law absolutely unapologetically, don't care what the United Nations might have to say about it or what the international law corpus says about that. And finally, the third characteristic, I would say, is a very high propensity for violence. These are not people who are, very interested in the niceties and complexities and intricacies of diplomacy, of negotiations. They don't really have allies or partners. They have puppet states and subjects. They are very, very easy to first threaten violence, and then if they can do it, and sometimes even when they can't, they do it in a silly way, they use violence. So all of this together, to summarize it, is a transnational, system of power run by a specific class of people. I don't think there's a conspiracy, that there is a room where the leaders of the empire meet and they have, a fixed hierarchy. These are basically, I'm not at all a Marxist, but in that case, I think we can speak of class interest. And there's a solidarity of the ruling elites in the United States and unfortunately in Europe who all greatly benefit from that. They remind me to some degree of the Soviet nomenclatura, which was the people who benefited from the Soviet system. There's something similar in the West. And they basically have complete and utter contempt for the opinion of the regular people in the West. I think that kind of brushes a rough portrait of what I call the empire.
Okay, so we have these folks that are running what we say is the empire. Would you say that the empire then is in terms of its influence and power? Has it reached its peak? Where on the bell-shaped curve would you say that the empire is right now in terms of power and influence?
It's on a downward slope very fast.
Okay. Yeah.
It certainly passed its peak of the peak of power of the empire was pretty much at the end of the Cold War. Now there are cracks literally all over the place. The two fundamental cracks that I see is, first of all, you could call it cultural or political. That is, that the United States, for instance, used to inspire people in many ways. Jazz music, NASA, great scientific discoveries. I mean, there was a lot of things that people admired about the United States, which was sincere. That, I think, is changing. The United States elicits very different reactions now. The same is true for Israel, who had a much better, I think, image in the past than it does now. And secondly, I think the crisis is made much more profound by the fact that I do not believe that the empire has nearly the military capabilities that it tries to convince people that it has. It has a formidable propaganda machine. But neither the Israelis nor Americans are that powerful militarily, and I think that triggers the biggest crisis of all, because they've pretty much beaten up on all of the small guys who couldn't offer meaningful resistance. And now what's left are countries who are very much capable of offering meaningful resistance, and they are not shaking in fear anymore. And there's the crisis of credibility in terms of how basically ineffective the threats of use of violence are currently.
Okay. Let's go over a timeline of key events, and I want to mention Poland's role in the U.S. empire, which is mainly through its membership in NATO. First, briefly, some quick dates in Polish history. 1795, Poland is literally wiped off the world map for the next 123 years. 1918, Poland reemerges on the world map after World War I. 1939, Poland is invaded and occupied after World War II. Then comes 1989. Poland regains independence and the Soviet Union breaks up. And the United States makes a commitment about not expanding NATO. Saker, can you tell us what exactly is NATO and its function up to 1989 and the commitment that the United States made regarding NATO when the Soviet Union broke up?
Well, in theory, NATO was supposed to be an alliance of countries trying to deter a possible Soviet attack after the end of World War II further west. That is actually very debatable, and a lot of things now are historically being rediscovered, reanalyzed, and rethought. I think there was a recollection is correct. The first Secretary General of NATO said that the point was to keep the Germans down, the Soviets out, and the Americans in.
Right.
I think that is a very good explanation of what NATO really is. I mean, it's primarily, well, you asked me first before the end of the Cold War. It was a military organization with a very strong political dimension. And I think nowadays, to jump forward, it has become primarily a political organization to subjugate Europe to American, and I would say even Anglo, because the British are really not part of Europe in many ways. They're much, the solidarity, the transatlantic solidarity of the Brits is much stronger with the U.S. than it would be with continental Europe. So it's a mix, a political and military organization which basically allows the United States to prevent Europe from becoming independent. Okay,
do you think that there still is a justification for the existence of NATO, because the Warsaw Pact dissolved after 1989. There was no more control there over those states. They became independent, and NATO was supposed to keep in check aspects of the power there. But that's all gone. Is there a reason to have NATO?
Well, yeah, the only reason is to make sure that Europe continues to obey the empire.
Okay.
In terms of military threat, most emphatically not. What is the military threat to Europe? The obvious one would be Russia, and that's laughable, because if you look at actually the size of the Russian military, the way it's deployed, but most crucially, and most people don't understand that, it's the way it is actually trained. You can tell, any military analyst can tell what an army is preparing to do by the way it trains, the way it it procures equipment, the kind of structure it gives to its forces. The Russian military is profoundly defensive. The Russians don't actually have the means to conduct long-distance military operations. I mean, even in Syria, we see a perfect example. Depends on where you look on the map, but you could say that Syria is roughly 1,000 kilometers away from Russia. And the Russians actually had to get very creative and do things they'd never done in the past to even sustain a very small force in Syria. The Russian force in Syria is actually very, very small. To imagine that the Russians would attack anybody east of Russia, first of all, begs the question of why. What does Russia need more land? I'm not sure it does. In terms of, what is it going to do? Get some kind of very interesting and tempting industries in the West? Why would Russia even want to fight anybody in the West? Not to mention that, culturally speaking, the Russian society now has a profound aversion for military operations, imperial policies. I mean, Russia is your typical post-imperial country who has absolutely no desire to become what it was in the past, i.e. the Soviet Union. That's a myth that was spread by Brzezinski and also by Hillary Clinton, but it's a complete lie. The Russians have no use for anybody in the West, including the tiny little Baltic states. And they have absolutely no political desire to use force anywhere outside their own border to protect themselves. So the notion that the Russians would attack is ridiculous. The real threat to Europe, I would argue, is immigration and what's taking place in southern Europe, and generally the issue of immigration, which is not at all one that NATO is structured or designed to tackle at all. So I think NATO has no justification whatsoever other than keeping the European elites obedient and controlling Europe. Secondly, we see it very well now with Trump. They place very hard demands on the Europeans to purchase American equipment. So it's a great market for American industry generally, and particularly the military industry. That's another function. And really it keeps the elites of the empire in power. That's the real purpose of NATO. There's nothing else to it.
Very good. Let's move on in the timeline. Next, I want to mention 1999. That's the year that Poland actually joins NATO. And several days later, literally, NATO started a bombing campaign which destroyed Yugoslavia, smashing it into numerous small countries. Why did the U.S. empire decide to destroy the country of Yugoslavia?
I think the main reason was actually to make an example inside Europe and show that Russia is weak, and therefore we won't beat up Russia directly, but we will beat up what is perceived by many as a Russian ally, which is a debatable thing, but that's not the point right now. And to show, finally, it was, I call it the Kristallnacht of international law, to show that with the Soviet Union gone, the Anglo-Zionist empire just has contempt and has no use for international law whatsoever. So we'll violate international law smack in the middle of Europe, and the Europeans will meekly accept that. So it was also a fantastic demonstration of force, not so much inside Yugoslavia as it was a demonstration of political force in Europe itself. And the Europeans got caught in that. They became accomplices. This is a crucial thing that happens very often in politics, internally, international, and military things. You have allies who are equal partners towards a project, but once they become accomplices towards some kind of crime, doesn't matter what that crime is, it completely changes the quality of their relationship. They can't get out of it anymore. And the Europeans basically, by becoming the USA's accomplice in the breakup of Yugoslavia, essentially sold themselves out to NATO and to the empire, and ever since they've been there.
Right, and with no USSR as a sort of counterweight, the United States pretty much could do what they wanted internationally. I doubt that breakup would have happened if the Soviet Union was still around.
Well, that is a very important question, and rhetorically it's worth asking. Did the empire show its true face? Was it always as evil as it clearly showed itself to be after 1999, or did some changes take place? All I can say is that, at least in Switzerland, the country I know best, there used to be people who truly believed in neutrality in being outside blocs and to maintain an independent course. And I've seen these people leave key positions because basically the pro-empire interest groups inside the country gently or not so gently pushed them out and replaced them with pro-American puppets. So I think that probably very much the same happened in other countries, I think of France in particular.
Very good.